Satoru turned heel and stomped back through the kitchen doors. Angered by his own inability to see past his own troublesome amusement of learning of the fate of his peers through Yuji's reactions when question after question was bound to wear him down. Not to mention boring. A change of scenery was supposed to remedy that. Yuji had found familiarity in meeting Yaga. Trust, relief in seeing Satoru. Shock, confusion in riding in Ijichi's car. Fear, anger in dealing with Suguru. The last one was an outlier Satoru had unintentionally overlooked, but even if he had, 3 out of 4 odds swung in his favor of this morning excursion to the dining hall going quite well. At the very least, he wanted Yuji to have a decent meal and feel a bit more at ease with where he'd be staying for the time being. Running into anyone else was expected, but not guaranteed. This was supposed to be fun. A notion only someone who had been blind would come up with. To consider any other possibility had been treated as accepting defeat over being realistic. Acknowledging the possibility was not a choice in Satoru's mind. He refused to even humor it. He would still refuse what his mind had already pieced together as he stood over the kitchen counter to stare at the battered onion remains he'd left behind not moments ago. Is something wrong, Gojo-senpai? Obviously. Everything about this was wrong. Is Yuji-kun going to be okay? Heibara looked to Satoru for answers, having placed his knife down on the counter with little intention to pick it back up again until the atmosphere of the room had recovered. Yuji? He'll be fine. The confidence in Satoru's voice did not match his concern, but if Big Brother Chozo wasn't pulling his hair out over Yuji's disappearing act, then perhaps he could believe the words he spoke. He's a tough guy. That's good. But did we say something we weren't supposed to, or? You've done no such thing. It was Chozo who answered next, returning to his spot by the counter he had previously occupied. He did not sit down, but remained standing as he spoke through the window that connected both the kitchen and dining hall together. You'll have to forgive my little brother. He recently lost someone dear to him, and coming to terms with it has been difficult. Sometimes he gets overwhelmed and requires a moment to collect himself. There was no doubt in Satoru's mind about who that dear someone was. Yuji was fine until Nanami walked in, the second year unable to finish his sentence before the younger teenager ran off. Before they could introduce themselves. Before eye contact could be made. Why should Satoru be upset? Sure, Yuji was upset, and through the power of human empathy, that particular emotion wiggled its way in and infected the both of them, but it had to be for Yuji's sake. Satoru, the individual, should not be feeling a stranglehold over his heart as took a glimpse at the Nanami he knew, still standing and completely lost on what had just transpired around him. Nanami was alive and well, and that would not change anytime soon. Or at all. Satoru will do better this time. I'm sorry he's going through that. It can't be easy. Heibara turned down to his workstation, nodding as new determination filled his eyes. Then we'll make sure to have everything ready for when he comes back, just like Gojo-senpai said. But as Heibara was about to return to preparing breakfast, a fourth voice cut in to stop him. Excuse me for the interruption, but what context am I missing? Not going to remain silent forever. Nanami had raised his hand during his approach, putting a few seats between himself and Chozo as he joined them at the counter across from Heibara. That was Yuji-kun. He's our new first year. Despite the interruption to the flow of their previous conversation, Heibara's excitement for Yuji's presence had not waned in the slightest. We're senpais now. I wasn't aware that we were getting any new students. Nanami turned to Satoru for confirmation, to which the third year complied. Yuji's situation is a bit complicated right now. A lot of paperwork and boring stuff, so he's technically not on the books yet. Regardless, he's staying here with his older brother, so everyone has to play nice. That's not concerning at all. Ever the perceptive one, Nanami pointed at Chozo. Does it have to do with why you feel like a cursed spirit? You're also too old to be a student. Explain. Don't be rude, Nanami. Heibara chastised his classmate's behavior as he moved on to dicing the green pepper in his hand. It's probably because of his cursed technique. Like Gito senpai's. I'm right, aren't I? Something like that. Satoru wasn't going to go into detail, nor did he have to. Chozo simply shrugged at the explanation, doing nothing to deny or confirm it, as allowing the second year's assumptions to fill in the blanks was much easier than fabricating a lie on the spot. Honesty, while appreciated, may ruin the pleasant atmosphere Satoru was trying to rekindle. Still, the curse made it clear why he was there in the first place. You are correct. I will not be attending the school, only accompanying my little brother wherever his path takes him. Wow, you really do care about him a lot, don't you, Itadori-san? You're guilting me into calling up my little sister later. We haven't spoken in a few days. I can't have her getting worried, or I'll be in for an earful. She's kind of scary like that. Chozo tilted his head at Habara, hung up on how the second year had addressed him. Itadori-san? I didn't want to be rude. Is that not your surname? No, it's. The curse paused, glancing to where Yuji had been sitting beside him just moments prior. He presented the tiniest of smiles before dropping it completely in favor of the usual reserved look that clung to his face. Chozo is acceptable. Please use my first name from now on. It's what everyone else does. Due to the nature of the death painting's inception, Chozo was a kamo. Satoru supposed that meant the cursed spirit could take up their name if he chose to, but from the sound of it, he's shed away from that connection entirely. Yuji wasn't related to them in a traditional sense. And since his surname came from his father's side, and it was his mother who turned out to be the parent they shared, using Itadori's name wasn't exactly on the table either. Or they may have never even considered it. Okay, no problem then. Chozo-san it is. Accepting the older brother's request, Habara collected the vegetables in front of them into two separate bowls. Satoru stepped out of his way, only returning to the counter when the second year placed a block of cheese in one hand and a grater in the other. The instructions were obvious, and it didn't take a genius to figure out which side to press the cheese block against. Do you know what Yuji-kun likes in his omelette? Any allergies I need to be aware of? None to my knowledge. He's not a picky eater either. Awesome. I can tell we're going to get along real well. Yuji and Habara never met each other before today. If they had, it certainly wasn't like this. The first person Yuji wasn't predisposed to, why was that so unnerving? Despite Satoru's help in the preparation, Habara took full control of the kitchen once it came time to return to the stovetop with experience in hand. The third year was reduced to retrieving the plates and cutlery. Nanami watched him with mild concern, his ears tuned into Habara's impromptu lesson on how to cook an omelette properly. Their collective memory then came together to work the orders of everyone present while guessing what their missing classmates would want for when they trickled in sometime later. Surprisingly, Chozo did not argue Habara's breakfast offering, not that the second year would or his younger brother would let him if he was present. And speaking of Yuji. As the plates were slowly filling up, so did Satoru's concern. His eyes continued to drift toward the dining hall entrance when not fixated on the clock hanging above their heads, impatiently waiting for Yuji's return. Satoru had half the mind to drop everything and start the search for the missing teenager then and there. Their meal preparation was practically done, the last plate was about to be put together. Satoru's help was no longer needed. He exited the kitchen while struggling to untie the apron he'd let Habara coax him into wearing. Through his frustration, Satoru was able to get the damned thing untied, bundling the apron into a ball of cloth between his hands. About to be thrown on the nearest seat when a head poked through the entrance doors, too tall to be Yuji. Suguru. Gito-senpai. Habara heard his senpai's name from Satoru's mouth, greeting his entrance as he plated the last omelette. Good morning. Good morning to you too. The smile and curt wave that came with his greeting did nothing to hide just how unbearably drained he looked. I found something of yours, Satoru. Stepping through the doors, Suguru turned to look back over his shoulder, prompting an unmistakable head of pink hair to join him inside. The younger teenager kept his head tilted down. Eyes clearly avoiding the group around the countertop, with Suguru acting as a barrier to hide partially behind even though they weren't standing all that close. Would you believe he got lost? No. But for Yuji's sake, Satoru was certainly not going to call him out on it. Looking both better and worse, Yuji stood quietly in place as his brother rose from his seat to retrieve him. All the signs of a breakdown were there, from the red swollen cheeks to the scrunched up cloth of his jacket sleeves just shy of drying completely. Yuji-kun, welcome back. We just finished setting everything out. Habara joined them in the hall proper, tempering his excitement with a lower voice from when they first met. Unless you want to take it back to, I was going to say your dorm, but I don't know if you guys have that settled yet. Chozo, prepared to answer for him, was stopped by Yuji's quick response. We're staying at the guest house. And it's okay, I'll eat here. I don't want to inconvenience you all further. The younger teenager took in a noticeably heavy breath before lifting his head to face the second year. Only for his eyes to get caught up in the one sitting at the counter behind him. You didn't get a chance to talk earlier, but that grump over there is Nanami. He's in his second year like me. Don't mind the attitude, he's like that 'cause it's early in the morning and he hasn't had his coffee yet. Of course, Nanami had to take objection, leaving his meal behind to take matters into his own hands. What a poor way to introduce someone. They should stop this now, before it got worse. Satoru, Chozo, hell, even Suguru may as well step in since the pale look mirroring his own revealed what he must already know. But all three were too focused on gauging Yuji's reaction, unsure when they should cut the conversation short or let it play out. Given that the younger teenager hadn't bolted out the door a second time. Quivering palms matched the chaotic energy sparking off Yuji's shoulders. The twitching only got worse when Nanami drew closer, aware enough of Yuji's reaction to avoid invading his personal space as he assessed the first year that had run off not too long ago. To the surprise of the three observing with the added context behind Yuji's nerves. He quickly straightened himself to an almost comedic degree before dropping his hands to his sides and stiffly bowing his head. I'm Itadori Yuji. He practically shouted it, the words rushing together to the point where if Nanami hadn't heard the pieces of his name prior, he wouldn't be faulted for assuming they were all one word. Nanami returned the greeting with a bow of his own. Nanami Kento. Nice to meet you, Itadori-kun. The hint of a smile crept across the sides of Yuji's cheeks, disappearing quickly as he raised his head, retreating back a step once his determination faltered. He'd turned away from the second year as well, still nodding his head to return the sentiment as best he could. Satoru wasn't sure he was allowed to be jealous, given current circumstances, but he certainly was feeling it. Just a little bit. I don't know about any of you, but I've waited long enough to eat breakfast, speaking over their heads with his usual energy. Satoru patted Yuji on the back of his shoulder as he walked back to the counter with his plate in his sights. Aren't you going to be joining us? Gito-senpai. Habara's question prevented Suguru from immediately turning tail and booking it by bringing the spotlight back to him. We already made you a plate. Gojo-senpai helped with cooking this morning. Satoru flashed a proud look Suguru's way, ready to accept the praise he so rightfully deserved. His friend however placed a finger against his cheek, as if to mull over his options a lot harder than Suguru actually was before that desired praise never came. If that's the case, then for the betterment of my health I have to pass. How dare he? Actually, how dare all of them continuously poke fun at the one skill he was in the midst of perfecting. I will shove this down your throat if you don't eat it, you ungrateful heathen. Naturally offended, Satoru took both his plate and Suguru's in each hand. With the latter's pulled back in mock preparation to chuck it at him if it came down to it. And give me food poisoning this early in the morning. Gito-senpai, Habara is the one who did most of the work. It's safe for human consumption. Nanami proved his point by taking a bite of his meal, fed up with waiting for his two upperclassmen to begin eating. Between the three of them, Suguru's excuses for avoiding breakfast ran dry. Satoru did take pity on him, placing their breakfast at one of the tables away from the counter where everyone else had taken to eating after Nanami claimed the far stool for himself. Habara naturally took to Nanami's side. The second year then slid down Yuji and Chozo's plates as the two who had followed after them before noticing where the third years were sitting. trapped in avoiding that bit of awkwardness that would come if they were to move seats now. Any silence between them would not last long, with Haibara making conversation in between bites, sharing everything detail from his mission he could think of while coaxing Nanami to do the same. While still worried about Yuji, nothing about his posture from behind brought about any immediate cause for concern. Leaving Satoru to trust Chozo to take care of him while he turned to the person now sitting across from him at their personal table. Suguru hadn't made a move to touch his omelette. It's really bland. Super boring. Easy on the stomach. Nothing like mine. Satoru took a bite, showing the excessive amount of cheese curled inside. It's an American recipe, but he rolled them up like traditional tamagoyaki. Best of both worlds. Is that more cheese than, you know what? I should be grateful you aren't eating raw sugar instead. Hesitant, Suguru eventually picked up his chopsticks to humor a tiny bite of his own. By the looks of it, Suguru didn't hate it, but he wasn't about to dive in for more either. Baby steps. Lowering to a whisper, Satoru took the opportunity to poke Suguru about what happened while Yuji was out of his sight. I assume, you know about? Yes, Suguru knew who Satoru was referring to. There wasn't a good reason for either to say his name out loud. They were close. You think? At least Yuji looks like he's doing a lot better, more than I thought he would after disappearing as fast as he had. It wasn't the most miraculous of changes. But to see the younger teenager sit there with only minor jitters whenever Nanami spoke was a featuring worth praising. Like Satoru said before, Yuji was a tough kid. Did you say something or? I doubt I'm responsible for this turnaround. Perhaps some things are just easier to confront than others. There it was. The same hint of bitterness from yesterday once again seeped into Suguru's words. Satoru forcefully swallowed the half-chewed egg in his mouth, maneuvering away from that line of thought. It's not like we have anything to worry about. Whatever happened ain't gonna happen now that I know to keep my eye out. Is that what you'll do? Watch over everyone indefinitely on top of everything else? Why not? His friend's skepticism was confusing. Maybe the declaration was a tad impractical for a normal person, but Satoru's power was not something anyone could easily rival. Even those who worked against him in the future had to resort to locking him away, unable to face him directly. The threats Yuji spoke of could be countered. The lives that were lost could be prevented. Fate doesn't mean shit to me. The future is what we make it, and I'm not married to the one Yuji came from. It's that easy. That's not, never mind, Suguru muttered, shoving whatever objection he could have in favor of a more pressing issue. If you're so confident in your plan, start by keeping a better eye on Itadori. Our sensei is putting a lot of faith in you, don't make him regret it. Like I said, easy. Suguru disagreed. Sukuna speaks to him. Did you know that? Satoru put down the next bite he'd planned to take, letting the conversation of those sitting at the counter drown out their own for just long enough to see if anyone was listening in. I suspected. In Ijichi's car, Yuji spoke about having to ignore him. Helped me put together how the two operated since his case of possession isn't exactly a standard one we learned in class. As he poked at his eggs, Satoru leaned into the knuckles of his hand. What does the great king of curses have to say? Nothing that bears repeating. The curse seems to find enjoyment in breaking his vessel's self-worth, not that Itadori appears to have much of it to begin with. Harsh, but we already knew being Sukuna's vessel hasn't been easy on him. Satoru let out a mild chuckle, earning a questionable look on Suguru's face in need of clarification as to why. Look at you, caring. You're getting all attached. It's adorable. I don't. And I'm not. R2. I can see it on your face. You're even referring to him differently. None of that bullshit from before. If only Chozo could get the same treatment. I'm keeping an eye out for possible danger, and Itadori's ability to keep that curse in check protects the rest of us from harm. Unlike you, I'm not taking this lightly. Suguru, on the defensive, shoves a bite into his mouth before turning away, mumbling the rest between his teeth. He's a good kid, objectively. Do your job and keep it that way. You say that like we aren't in this together. Morning losers. Both conversations came to a halt as Shoko entered the building, coffee in hand. The most put together in the room, she certainly took her time getting ready to achieve such a look. While she acknowledged her fellow third years, going so far as to flick the back of Satoru's head as she passed by, her sights were on someone else in particular. Look who's back. Shoko stopped behind Nanami's seat. You better not be avoiding me if you got any injuries on that mission of yours. Because someone got hurt and he's very grateful that I was available, Habara. I am grateful. You're acting like I got hurt on purpose, Habara whined, with Nanami responding close behind him. Good morning, Iori-senpai. My injuries were minor and have already been treated with adequate care. There was no reason for me to bother you this early in the morning. I'm sure your schedule is already filled up as it is. Actually, I'm free today. Technically on standby, but for once the world isn't burning enough to need my immediate attention. That explains how Shoko had indulged herself this morning. Now, I assume you boys made something for me, or do I have to fend for myself? The two at the table remained quiet as Shoko took a seat next to Habara. Exchanging greetings with the rest of the people beside her while offering an additional wave to Yuji, much to Habara's shock at learning he was one of the last to meet their new first year. His exclamation was enough for Shoko to realize what the story was, and she knew better than to claim Yuji was anything less. It was funny, in a way, with almost everyone here and barely any of the seats filled in the dining hall, the nearly empty building managed to feel packed to the brim. Good morning, Gojo-senpai. Gito-senpai. The aforementioned pair whipped their heads around, startling the underclassmen standing over them. Ijichi Satoru wrapped his arm around the frazzled teenager and dragged him down into the seat next to him. Come, sit. We have so much to talk about. When was the last time we saw each other? Shifting to a whisper, Satoru cut to the chase. How's the search going? Search. Suguru moved closer in his seat, looking to Satoru to explain rather than the soul trapped underneath his arm. I asked Ijichi to look to do a background check on a kid who shares Itadori's name. Please take the hint, Suguru. Discreetly, because he's in a complicated situation. Yes, well, I managed to unearth a few things last night if you're willing to hear them. Ijichi shimmied out of Satoru's hold to grab the scrunched up notepad he kept in his uniform pocket. Fixing his glasses back into their proper place, Ijichi turned several pages until he landed on the one he was after. Proceed. Itadori Yuji, 4 years old. His parents are Itadori Jin and Kaori. A resident of Sendai under the legal guardianship of his grandfather, Itadori Wasuke. Currently enrolled in kindergarten close to his home. His parents aren't in the picture. Satoru wasn't surprised in the least, humming as he listened to Ijichi's explanation. They were reported missing in late 2003, 6 months after their son was born. There was no explanation given for their disappearance. One day they were home, the next they were gone. Wasuke is their son's only living relative, so naturally, custody fell to him. Ijichi flipped to the next page, a hell of a lot emptier than the one before it. I looked further into their family history for any connection to jujutsu sorcery, curious if cursed spirits and the like were to blame, but that came up empty. On the surface, there is nothing to separate the Itadori family from the rest of the non-sorcerer population. None of his family are sorcerers. Out of all the details, that was the one Suguru was most interested in. Then again, Suguru's family weren't sorcerers either. It probably struck a chord with him. Not from what I could find. If any were, they have no connections to jujutsu tech and the regulations that govern it. Private sects of sorcerers aren't uncommon, but I found nothing to back up that being the case. When I looked even deeper, most of what I found were dead ends with missing documentation, especially on Jin's wife and her family. Of course they were not going to find anything about Corey's moonlighting as a curse user mastermind from over 1,000 years ago. But Satoru was expecting a bit more than what Ijichi could come up with. The report felt, for lack of a better term, mundane. There was a mystery behind it, Yuji's parents and all that, but the rest was just about some abandoned kid in Sendai. Which shouldn't be the case, given his status as Sukuna's vessel. Assuming Yuji's claim of being born for the role, one would think that fake Kamo would want to keep their kid under a more watchful eye. Or have him descend from a powerful sorcerer lineage, as that made more sense to Satoru for Yuji's ability to contain a curse of that magnitude. He wondered if the grandfather was in on it. A not so pleasant thought, but they had to be open to the possibility if they were going to track down this body-snatching curse user before their goals of genocide and death matches were brought to fruition. At the very least, the report aligned with what Yuji had revealed of his personal life so far. The age and family situation matched up, and if Satoru were to poke around some more and receive the same answers regarding his hometown and such, it would only serve to boost his credibility. Not that his cell phone wasn't enough, crap. Yuji's cell phone. I can look into getting a printed copy of what I found. Quick question. Completely off topic, but how would you go about getting some pictures off a phone if the battery's dead and you had no way to charge it? The charging port is busted. The new topic caught Ijichi off guard, but he had an answer for him despite that. Assuming the phone had a memory card of some kind, you could remove it and get the photos developed that way. You could then bring it to a print shop or a self-serve kiosk within a convenience store if they have one. That fits perfectly in my plan for today. With 2 thumbs up, Satoru beamed a smile at the younger teenager beside him. This is why you're the best, Ijichi. Since when did you plan? Sugiru's comment went ignored as Satoru stood up from his seat, excited to address the rest of the hall. Attention. All eyes on me, Nanami, turn around or I will come over there. Satoru clapped his hands until he got what he wanted and several pairs of confused eyes were on him. The good news is, we have off from classes today. Sensei's busy taking care of some official business, and since we don't have any other teachers available at the moment, we third years are in charge. Eat up and get ready, because we're going out today. That is a terrible idea. Well, I like it. Does your sensei approve of this? I guess, it depends on where we go. We were out yesterday. Quiet. Quiet. Satoru turned to address Sugiru's irritated glare. We were out for like, half a day and then stuff got in our way. With those 2 back from their missions, Shoko free from the shackles of the nurse's office, and a new student to settle in, this is exactly what everyone needed. And it's not like we're going to the same place. I was thinking we could walk around Hachiji since it's way closer. Have you ever been to Hachiji, Yuji? No. Yuji's answer was more of a question, but he was too busy shying away in his seat to worry about how it came out. Then it's settled. Ijichi can drive. The car won't fit everyone. Groaning, Satoru shook his head at Ijichi before amending the plan. Fine. We'll take a bus. Like a bunch of non-sorcerers on a field trip, manifesting the ability to teleport needed to happen a lot sooner. Another thing to poke Yuji about. Satoru's future self had to have cracked the code in the last decade, and just maybe, if Satoru learned how, he could skip right to the results instead of wasting time figuring it out. Without warning, Sugiru got up from his seat to stare Satoru down from across the table. He looked ready to burst, but he contained himself well enough to limit what may have been so much more, to 3 simple words. I'm not going. What do you mean I'm not going? Satoru rushed after his friend, who was already out the door by the time Satoru processed his words, and shouted after him. Sugiru, get back here. Refusing to let up his pace, Satoru restored to yanking back Sugiru's shoulder to force him to turn around. You're going. I'm not. Suguru pulled away from him, but Satoru caught the edge of his sleeve. They both stood there, neither one moving from a position, as they both knew what was bound to happen next. Yes, you are. Satoru, admittedly I'm not in the best shape this morning and would prefer to spend the rest of the day without getting involved in more unnecessary trouble. It's just a few hours. At least stay for a little bit, then you can go home on your own if you really have to. Satoru grit his teeth as he tried to reason when his demands weren't met. Everyone looks like they could use a day off. We've never had the whole group together like this in, what? Weeks? Months? 3 to be exact. Has it really been that long? See, all the more reason to go. Satoru. Sugiru's arm went slack in Satoru's hold, a very different means of pushing away. One that worked, as Satoru let go to watch his friend's hand retreat into his pocket. Suguru said nothing for a bit, telling Satoru from that alone he was still thinking over the offer, even as his body language made it clear that his friend was going to leave, regardless. I'll think about it. Okay? The rest of you allowed enough to inform me when you'll be leaving. If I don't go, respect my decision. I can't make any promises. Satoru gave him a half-hearted smile as he watched Suguru walk off on his own. Before rounding the corner, Suguru glanced back his way, shaking his head at Satoru's answer before disappearing behind the building completely. Suguru will be back before he knew it. Satoru was sure of it. He had to be. Yet his normally unshakable confidence had shifted on its base, leaving just enough room for doubt to trickle underneath. All he had were his words to convince himself that wasn't the case. I have to agree with your friend. Not you too, Satoru mumbled, knowing full well it was loud enough for Chozo to hear. He wasn't paying enough attention to how long the curse had been standing just outside the doorway behind him. Your sensei requested my brother and I to remain in the guest house. While he was aware of your refusal to adhere to that request, leaving the campus may stretch his patience a bit too thin. I mean, if he already knows I'm going to get in the way of his request, then I don't see what the problem is. We'll be back before he knows we're gone since he's busy figuring out what to do about the whole meet and greet you two were planning. Satoru crossed his arms, letting his back fall against the building's outside wall as his eyes continued to linger where Suguru had been. I don't want to lose his good graces. You won't. If anything happens, just blame me for it. Arguing about this was becoming annoying. We also have to restock the guest house and stealing from the dining hall won't cut it. I don't like grocery shopping, but I'm sure you can handle it. You bought food for Yuji already, haven't you? Yes, I have. But... Satoru raised a finger, unwilling to hear another objection. This is rare for me to admit, so consider yourself honored to even hear these words. I fucked up bringing Yuji out this morning. I didn't realize what would happen when he saw Nanami. The teenager gestured back to the dining hall, pausing just long enough for the voices inside to reach their ears. He seems to be doing better now, right? Let me make up for it by just letting everyone be normal for a few hours, away from all the jujutsu bullshit. And if you manage to get his phone in my hands, I may have found a way to print those pictures while we're out. It's a win for everyone. It felt cheap using Yuji as a bargaining chip, but when Chozo's glaring weakness of looking after his brother was something Satoru could not only agree with but actively do something to help. Was it really all that wrong? If you say so. The bus to Hachiji was 10 minutes behind schedule. Patience was never something Satoru could never claim he had, nor would he ever not ingest. He would have made his frustration everyone else's problem if it wasn't for the last straggler joining their group after 5 minutes had passed the designated pickup time. Taking his time down the road, Suguru offered little more than a shrug as he joined the rest of them in their wait. He kept to himself, purposefully standing outside the bus stop while the younger students and Chozo waited inside. The hint was clear. Unfortunately for Suguru, neither Satoru nor Shoko were ones to read into such things, moving themselves closer to their fellow third years to welcome him along their excursion. You came late on purpose, Shoko teased, grabbing onto Suguru's arm in an effort to chain him down. If you had shown your face just as the bus left, Gojo would have stopped the bus and dragged you on. Following Shoko's lead, Satoru claimed the other arm for himself. I really would. It's already running late. What are a few more minutes? If I didn't come, I'd never hear the end of it. Suguru let out a heavy sigh. Occasions like this are a rarity. Still, don't get mad at me if I don't want to get dragged into every building that catches your eye. You can sleep on a bench for all I care. Suguru tagging along was enough all on its own. I just might. The ride itself lasted for roughly an hour, though the only one who might know the exact length of the journey was Nanami. As he checked his watch frequently enough while being in the midst of the couple conversations bouncing around overhead. The group waited until the bus reached the city center before getting off. Banking on the central city blocks to hold the greatest variety of shops and businesses to peruse through during their visit. Despite being over a week since the Hachiji festival had swept through the streets, Bon season ensured that the visiting population was dense enough to warrant a bit of coordination between them to avoid losing anyone to the ever-moving foot traffic. Ultimately, the agreement that worked best for everyone was to meet up every hour or so to check in, with the intervals of time in between to be spent doing whatever each person wished. This led to the larger group splintering off into smaller ones of which the members came and went, shuffling around between each other throughout the day. Satoru stuck by Sugiru's side at first, claiming a sense of victory when he was able to coax him into a clothing store neither of them would ever buy from. He did not have to worry much about the two time travelers they were with. Yuji and Chozo remained close by, never leaving Satoru's sight if able, but made no attempt to intrude in his conversations unless prompted to. From what Satoru could observe, Yuji spent much of the time explaining an assortment of things to his older brother when confusion arose. Like a kid explaining to an old man how a computer worked, but in this case, it was credit cards and discount memberships neither of them was in need of. The two eventually left when the second years passed by the front window, Habara beckoning their attention from outside. Sometime after their departure, Sugiru headed off on his own as he said he would. His social batteries reached their limit early. If he wanted to spend the next half hour walking around alone, that was his choice to make. Consequently, that left Satoru with a vacancy in the companion to drag around department, and thus, the search for where Yuji ran off to had begun and ended a couple of businesses down the road. For the first time, Satoru got to witness Yuji on his own, big brother nowhere to be seen. The displaced time traveler was staring up at a tacky sign advertising video rentals inside. After pressing both his hands together at the palms, Yuji muttered an inaudible prayer before peeking inside the front door. By the time Satoru made it to the entrance, Yuji had already delved further inside, sifting through rows of DVDs packed away in box displays that made up the middle aisles of the store. His fingers ran along the tops of each case, eager to see what was in stock. His face, in contrast, was tucked underneath a despondent frown, lighting up only when Satoru pulled him out from whatever stupor he'd fallen into. "I thought Chozo was attached to your hip?" Sensei Yuji jumped in his uniform, unaware that Satoru had snuck up on him. "Habara, Senpai heard we were buying groceries and wanted to show him this produce stand and something about secret older brother stuff. I don't get it, but I promised not to go anywhere else, so he was okay with me checking this building out while they did their thing." That's not surprising. Habara's always been good at making friends. Friends, the younger teenager hung on that word a bit too long before he let out a cough, flipping over the DVD in his hand to the backside. "I can see it. He seems like a very nice person." There was a brief moment of silence, begging Satoru to fill in the air with something to get their conversation rolling again. "So, are you doing okay? That could have come out better. Less awkward, definitely not as forced." At least they weren't making eye contact, or Yuji might pick up on the way Satoru's lips were twitching at the edge of his mouth. "I'm okay. I mean, as good as I can be." "Did Gito-san tell you what happened over breakfast or?" "Nah. Well, he implied a lot of things, so I put the rest together. It must be hard seeing everyone like this, but you're handling it really well. Good job. Sorry your future sucks." "It's not your fault. Why does it feel like it is?" Yuji looked up from the movie in his hands. "And we're going to make sure it doesn't happen again. Like you said, nothing to worry about this time around." The atmosphere went from comfortably air-conditioned to annoyingly heavy in such a way his own infinity couldn't work against. Satoru's instinct begged him to rectify this shift, forcing the conversation to switch gears to something much less emotionally taxing. "Obviously. Anyway, since you like movies, let's pick out a small stack to bring back as something to do when Yaga tries to enforce house arrest on all of us." Satoru picked up the first cover that caught his eye. Some B-rated thriller by the looks of it. "This one looks good." Double quote. The two exchanged the DVDs in their hands for the other, assessing the options as Yuji tapped at the cover with his finger in recognition. "I remember this. The heroine is kind of annoying, but she dies spectacularly in the end, so I guess the watch was worth it." Satoru went to open his mouth, only to close it, only truly realizing just what Yuji had done when a shit-eating grin stretched itself across the younger teenager's face. "I'm sorry, Sensei." Yuji laughed. He laughed. He wasn't sorry at all. "I couldn't help myself. You have to understand, I had to do it the moment I recognized it. All because I happen to spoil movies. Occasionally, you have to do it too." "Is that how it works?" With a light flick of the wrist, Satoru smacked the DVD case he was holding against Yuji's head. If it were anyone else, he would have done worse. But for Yuji, here and now, he'd make an exception. "You spoiled this exact one for me. And I'll make sure to do it again, whether it meant waiting 11 years to meet Yuji's smaller counterpart all grown up or telling a 4-year-old the ending to that movie unprompted." Satoru swore to get back at him. Was this how paradoxes started? "You're such a sore loser." From across the movie display, Shoko stood with a lollipop in hand to designate to whom she was referring. "Gojo, you're going to get kicked out for acting like such a child. Maturity is boring and overrated." Satoru had heard the entrance bell ring when Shoko walked in. Fortunate it was Shoko and not one of the second years. Or else there'd be a lot more explaining to do. "And I'd like to see them try to kick me out." "I wouldn't." Yuji shot an apologetic look over to the cashier at the register. "If we're going to follow any of Yaga-san's rules, could it be the one where we don't cause a scene? Now that you mention him, Yaga-sensei doesn't watch movies with us." "And before you say anything," Shoko pointed at Satoru. "The movies he put on for class when he needed a break from lecturing don't count." She then popped her sucker back into her mouth before spreading her arms across the DVD cases when standing. Straight apparently became too much for her. "So why are you and this idiot watching so many movies?" "Not saying you can't. Just curious." "Oh, that's because it was part of my training." "Training?" Shoko looked at Satoru as if he had the answer, but he hadn't a clue what Yuji was talking about. "Yeah, I needed help controlling the flow of my cursed energy. Yaga-san made this cursed doll that would punch me if I didn't give it a constant output of a specific level of energy." Yuji curled his fists and punched the air. "The movies were a way to force me to keep my energy constant while experiencing different emotions and stuff. I got hit so many times. After I got my energy under control, we just sort of fell into the habit of watching movies after physical training since there wasn't a lot else I could do in Sensei's basement." A moment of silence fell between them. A prelude to the ensuing disaster the moment the last sentence clicked in the upperclassmen's heads. "I always knew you were a pervert." Without missing a beat, Shoko sent a kick at Satoru's legs from underneath the display. If his infinity hadn't been active, the end result would have been him, on the floor, clutching his leg and holding back the tears which would have formed in his eyes. "Yuji, get over here. I'll protect you from that bad, awful man." Shoko rounded the corner of the display to grab Yuji's hand and tug him away from Satoru's side. "You don't even know the context. And don't say shit like that out loud." Shoko raised her eyebrows at Satoru, unconvinced by his words. "Tell me, what context makes any of what I heard okay? You're keeping a child in your basement." In unison, both third years turned their heads to Yuji, prompting him to play through what he'd just said. "I'm starting to realize why Kujisaki was mad at Sensei when I first told her where I had been staying those last couple months." "Oops." Yuji rubbed the back of his neck as he wrestled his hand free from Shoko's grasp. "It really wasn't like that, Iori-san. I needed a place to stay while pretending to be dead. Further context, that mission that I mentioned with the cursed wound ended with me sort of dying, but I came back. Blame Sukuna, it's a long story. Sensei thought the higher-ups sent us on that mission while he was away on purpose, and he wanted me to get stronger before revealing I wasn't actually dead at the exchange event. How many times has this kid died? Smart plan, future me." Satoru decided that he was going to ride this "I told you so" moment for the rest of the day, or as long as Shoko would be disgusted by it. "Looking out for my future students' well-being. And for you to assume the worst of me, Shoko? I'm hurt. Because you're the worst. It's fitting. You're so mean." Having to pretend to be dead must have been a pain. Not that you wouldn't want to spend time with me, can't imagine anyone who wouldn't because I'm a riot, but I assume not everyone knew about it? Yuji nodded. Only you, Iori-san, Ijichi, and Nanami knew. I actually met Nanami during that time and I got to accompany him on a few of his missions. All this movie watching you made me do came in handy, cause it's a long story too. Trying to break free from the stuttering, Yuji's grip tightened on the DVD case in his hands as he looked up at Satoru with newfound intensity. There's this guy, a boy, probably 6 or 7 now, his name is Yoshino Junpei, and he can see curses. He lives in Kawasaki. Junpei should be fine now, but when he's older, my age, he should attend Jujutsu Tech. He'd probably be a 2nd or 3rd year compared to me, but that's okay. And he likes movies too. A lot. You'll like him. There didn't need to be a reason. Satoru could figure out why Yuji was so adamant all on his own. Something definitely happened to this Junpei kid, and nothing good was coming to mind when he tried to put together what. Oh really? You think you know the kind of people I like? Satoru grabbed another DVD to form a pile with what they already had. I'll be the judge of that when I meet him. It was amazing how a simple sentence could instantly brighten up Yuji's face. There was no binding vow to his words, nor was Satoru going to make one, but he didn't find any issue with agreeing to Yuji's request either. He'll commit the name to memory and come back to it later. Perhaps there's a picture of this kid Yuji could show him. It'll make tracking down this Junpei all the easier when the time comes if their meddling didn't cause a butterfly effect on a grander scale to account for. The battery on Yuji's phone was pronounced dead during lunch. It was more of a snack break than an actual lunch, given that half the teenagers present opted for something to drink or a snack over a standard meal on the cafe menu. Their group had claimed 3 outdoor tables for themselves. Congregating heavily on the edges closest to one another to maximize the table space with the shortest amount of distance between the smaller clusters to allow cross-table discussion. Satoru had to observe the somber news from afar. Curly straw balanced between his teeth as he lamented his stolen seat at Habara's hands when the 2nd year started showing off some of the small goods he'd picked up from the corner store. Chozo had naturally taken to Yuji's other side, leaving Satoru to sit behind him and chime in once in a while as he felt the need to. Within one of the smaller moments Yuji got to himself as Habara ran over to shout something over at Ijichi and Nanami. He tucked his hands into his pockets to pull out his phone under the table. Clicking the power button only to receive nothing but an unchanging black screen. Yuji clicked it again. Then a 3rd time, pressing his thumb hard against the case to restart the device but to no avail. Time of death? Hard to say, but Satoru would place it sometime within the last couple of hours. Definitely during the morning. Chozo's hand on Yuji's back prevented the full manifestation of his panic. The curse doesn't scold him for it, merely opens his other hand and suggests he let go of the device for a little while. Yuji's struggle to let go was apparent, but as the food the group ordered rolled in, what resistance he had to the idea went away. He handed over his cell phone, gently placing it in his older brother's hand before the curse tucked it away within his sleeves. Not too long after, Chozo flashed the device behind his back, handing it off to Satoru discreetly as the two leaned close together to hide the handoff. Bingo. It was now time to enact the second part of Satoru's plan, first by sneaking away from the rest of the group in search of one of those self-service kiosks Ijichi had mentioned. Satoru did not have to stray far to find what he was after. Red, orange, and green popped against the white background of the signage plastered all around the next street corner. The 7-Eleven was practically begging for Satoru's attention, earning every bit of it once the teenagers' eyes fell on the small window decal advertising their printing service. Stepping inside revealed the convenience store to be nothing special beyond that, but Satoru wasn't here to shop. So he paid it no mind as he scurried over to the small kiosks hugging the wall a little way from the entrance. How to go about doing this? Satoru sat down on the complimentary chair and began with the tried and true method of poking buttons until he got to a screen demanding the thing from which he was extracting the photos. Even if this phone had been manufactured this year, Satoru was sure he couldn't just stick the damn thing into a slot, so retrieving the memory card was a must. There was a crease in the case, and with a little pressure, he could. Satoru heard an uncomfortable snap. Crap, the back wasn't going back onto this thing anytime soon. But, if the now exposed micro SD card was what he was looking for, he'd have to hope that returning with photo prints and a replacement phone would keep Yuji from getting too upset. The Satoru phone warranty never expires so long as his credit card remains usable. The teenager inserted the micro SD card in the appropriate slot, then waited a minute for nothing to happen before he realized it was not incompatible technology. But the fact the little slider on the card was in a position that prevented him from moving on to the final step, printing. And look at that. There's a print all button. Perfect. Now, Satoru had come in with the intent of violating Yuji's privacy. There was no way around it. He couldn't accept Yaga and Yuji's excuse for hiding a single image from him when all they had to do was tilt the phone his way. Was it petty? Yes. Did Satoru care? Absolutely not. But, when the first image slid out of the printer, his heart took a swan dive. Only to propel back up and smack him in the face as he lifted the print from the collection tray to hold between his fingers. It was a photo of him. Future Satoru was wearing the same uniform as he did in the photo Yuji had shown him back at the guest house. His features were a bit more defined, definitely a little taller than the height Satoru was currently, lacking in the usual confident smile as it appeared Yuji had caught him by surprise. The next few pictures were of the school campus from what looked to be outside a window, the boys' dorm hallway. And then the dorm Yuji must have been staying in if the boxes at the foot of the bed with his last name written on the side were anything to go by. It was the last image of the trio that Satoru could make out, the torn-apart box that Yuji's phone must have come in strewn along his desk, dating the scene as that of when he first got the device, probably playing around with the camera and snapping memories all in one go. A similar pattern continued as the images were printed, with location shots, pictures of food, or interesting things that caught Yuji's eye intermixing with the photos he could get of the people around him. There was a boy with sea urchin hair that appeared in a few of the early ones, but never did Yuji get a good shot of his face as he avoided the camera like the plague. With the opposite holding true for the girl that must have made up the first year class with the other two. She was found posing more often than not. The next image was that of much darker lighting. Yuji hadn't taken it. He was asleep on some couch with a hand clamped over the head of a stuffed bear with boxing gloves for hands passed out on the ground below him. Recognizing the scene from Yuji's prior story, the glow illuminating him in the dark must have been from the television out of view. The teenager could only guess who was responsible for taking the image and snickered as a result. Nanami and Ijichi appeared frequently for a while, both looking serious and professional with their suits and ties. Only making the scene of Nanami kneading dough with rolled sleeves and bits of flour dusting his shirt all the more amusing. Habara must have succeeded in getting him into cooking after all. Following those two were a few images of Satoru and Nanami, their future selves appearing to speak a lot more frequently than they currently do now. However, Nanami's tired scowl was timeless, a mirror image of the one Satoru was used to receiving now, but with a few added stress lines to boot. In the midst of all those shots, there was a standalone photo of some kid standing under the light of what was probably his front porch with a hand awkwardly waving in the air. He wasn't wearing a Jujutsu Tech uniform and wasn't in the images to come, which must have made him a civilian. Shoko and Yaga made their appearance within a series of baseball-themed images that came next. Shoko's hair got longer and Yaga got older, now sporting his own pair of shades and a spiky new haircut. Post-game shots included the teams, their coaches, and the wild assortment of students that were currently in attendance at both jujutsu schools. A double take was required when he saw the panda, convinced it was a mascot until the oddly human-acting panda appeared in subsequent photos which clarified that this was a student somehow. Yuji was going to have to explain that one in detail. Irie stood with the Kyoto school, designating her a teacher just as Satoru's future self, alongside an old man Satoru had thought would have keeled over dead in the next decade. Yuji was posing with one of her students in the next shot, a fist bump shared between them. A sign of friendship if Satoru ever saw one. Satoru was about to take a break from attempting to catch each image as they exited the printer. Wiping away what had to be sweat accumulating around his eyes from the summer heat as another picture just had to catch his eye. His hand stopped reaching midair in shock, the images currently in his possession falling to the ground and scattering along the floor as his grip on them faltered. Cursing, Satoru quickly fell to the floor to gather the stack of photos before they could get trampled. Unsettled by the way his fingers twitched about no matter how much he fought to keep them under control. There was no way he was on Yuji's camera roll. Scrambling back to his seat, Satoru dug through the prints that had since fallen in his way to retrieve the one that made his stomach lurch in the uncertainty of what he was looking at. There was no way. Satoru flipped the picture around to see if looking at it upside down would help his brain process the image easier. But it took an entire 360-degree spin to lock in exactly what the teenager was looking at. Sitting on the steps to a building within the campus with Yuji's arm wrapped around his shoulders as the camera looked down on him was a smaller version of Toji. Fucking Toji. The man whose face Satoru was never going to forget, his very features reflected in the unamused eyes staring back at him with a popsicle in hand. What the actual? The bastard did say he had a kid. Something about a sale to the Zenin clan. They'd only want him if he had a valuable curse technique. Those with curse techniques usually became sorcerers, that checks out. But why was he here, next to Yuji like they were? Satoru immediately flipped through the jumbled stack of prints, ignoring the bends and deformities he was making as he sifted through them all to double-check all the images with him involved. Coming to terms with this kid, Zenin? Fushiguro? Which name did he associate with? As Yuji's friend, dorm neighbor, classmate future Satoru's student and... He paused on the image of a restaurant table. Yuji was sitting behind the camera, the odd angle of the photo capturing the exact moment when Satoru's thumb pressed into the sea urchin head's cheek. Much to his apparent displeasure and Satoru's amusement. The murderous look in the kid's eyes was far from genuine, stemming from embarrassment more than anything else with hints of red popping up on his cheeks. Were they close? Or was future Satoru just like this with all his students? There wasn't any evidence to say he was, nor was there any against. Leaving the question unanswered as he continued to stare at the picture until the kiosk let out a series of chirps to indicate the prints were done. As strange a revelation that all was, there was one other that sought to top that. Creeping its way into the forefront of Satoru's mind as he lazily tossed about the remaining prints without nearly as much intrigue as when he first walked in. A few harsh taps against the flat surface to the right of the kiosk's touchscreen aligned the stack of prints well enough to be tucked in the envelope he swiped from the provided display. He took his time sliding everything inside, but lingered on actually closing it shut once the common thread which entangled all the photos he'd witnessed had reared its ugly head. Haibara wasn't in any of these. That made sense. Yuji did not appear to recognize him when they met this morning. Why that was, Satoru could not say, but the evidence currently in his hands proved that in the months Yuji had been a part of Jujutsu Tech, their paths had never crossed. What did not make sense, no matter how many times Satoru wrapped his head around it, was the other person missing from Yuji's camera roll. Someone who should have been in several of these photos. No matter how poor of a relationship Yuji had with his future counterpart, Satoru would have settled for seeing him cropped out of the shot for all he cared. Just one picture, no matter how small. That's all it would have taken to ease Satoru's twisting heart. Unfortunately for him, it would not matter how many times Satoru looked them over with a fine-tooth comb because he was not there. It only made sense that he would be there, he should be there, and he's not. Why? Where else would he be? Where was Sugiru's adult counterpart if not by Satoru's side? Notes. It was a bit of a challenge balancing the group scenes as I had a lot of smaller interactions I wanted to happen while still maintaining Satoru as our focus POV. Leaving a few things to remain in the background while still highlighting the important stuff. And oh boy, a lot happened. Notes in order of appearance. Playing off Habara's love for food and cooking, having him make this omelette chimera of recipe and preparation was something I thought would fun experimenting with. I've also snuck in another HC of mine that Habara got Nanami into cooking and food preparation in general. As that is something of a time-consuming activity many business-orientated people may forego in favor of pre-prepared meals. Yuji's parents and their relationship with Wasuke has been left to interpretation in the manga for quite some time now. I've dashed away any hopes of future-proofing this fic by just going with my own thing, so if it ends up being entirely off base, this is a separate timeline, and we do what we want here. XD. Hachiaja was chosen as their day trip destination as it was close to the mountains that Jujutsu Tech supposedly resides in Tokyo Prefecture. The Hachiji Festival is a popular summer event that draws in many crowds to the city and areas beyond it, making it an ideal tourist attraction as well. As Bon season is still happening, the crowds are a little tamer than that of Tokyo City, but not by much. This also marks the first time in the fic proper Bon is referenced. Yuji praying in front of the video rental store was a fun nod to the rapid takeover of streaming services in the last decade, bringing an end to the movie rental era. While rental places can still be found, it is nowhere near to the same degree as what there used to be. Invest in Netflix stocks Yuji. Become rich. Themovie Yuji spoiled is one right at the beginning of his training. Satoru was putting it in the DVD player when he spoiled the ending, and some things can never be forgotten. This was such a cute moment between then, I couldn't help but put it in. I actually looked up a 7-Eleven photo kiosk printing guide when writing this chapter. It's not so different from the ones that exist where I live, but I still had fun seeing how they worked nonetheless. Satoru managed to figure it out all on his own, and we're proud of him for it. It was really hard deciding what photos and images to talk about as Satoru went through them. I didn't want to do a full play-by-play of the series so far, and I didn't want half the chapter to be descriptions, so quite a few things got cut from the final version. That doesn't mean I won't come back to them and discuss more in the future, however. If I don't end up adding some of my favorite cuts in later chapters, I'll share them in a future author's note. Okay, that should be everything. And now both Satoru and Suguru officially know that something is up with the future, all that is left is for them to learn what that something is. As always, thank you all so much for reading. I hope you all enjoyed, and I'll see you in the next update.